You're listening to Questions on the Way podcast with Greg and Jeremy. Hello, welcome to Questions on the Way. We made it again.
We're here.
We made it. It's very early.
It is early for us.
Yeah.
You know what they say?
What?
I don't know, something about being early.
And a bird and a worm somewhere or something like that.
Something like that.
And so, but that's okay. We made it. So I think today you wanted to do a rapid fire.
Yeah, I thought just to kind of, as people get to know us a little bit, it'd be fun to do these rapid fire questions. So I've got 3 rapid fire questions for you this morning.
Oh, just for me.
Well, you can ask them to me after, but you don't know what they are. So the first one is, Greg, what is your favorite food?
That one's not too hard for me. As far as my absolute favorite food would be a penne pasta that my wife makes. I just love it.
It's like any sauce or just the pasta? It's
a marinara type sauce. So, it's so good. It's got capers in it, a little bit of, moose salami. We make moose salami. A little bit of that in there. Oh.
So you're thinking that's like, I feel like that's like a combination food. Like, what if it was just like food, like one food?
One food? Cheeseburger.
No, I mean like a single food.
That's a combination as well, huh?
Yeah, because it's burger and cheese and bread.
Probably a fruit. I really like pineapple.
Okay, then.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Okay. What's your favorite free time activity?
I think if I have I like to shoot guns. That's probably right up there. That or even just a hike or just go for a run, something like that. I enjoy doing that. I like go fishing with my boy. So I know that's like 4 different things, but
that's okay.
They're all tied though, I promise.
Yeah, okay. And then what's your favorite movie?
Well, as you know, I'm not a huge movie guy.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't think you've even seen Lord of the Rings, have you?
I haven't.
Oh, man.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
Is that your favorite movie?
I really like it. I wouldn't say it's my favorite. I would have to say my favorite few. My favorite movie, just like if you're like, what's your favorite movie? Because favorites are hard to pick.
Yeah.
But Top Gun. That's always my.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Oh man.
I think for nostalgic purposes.
Yeah, sure.
And like just I don't know. I was in like 8th grade. It was like just epic.
It's so cool.
Yeah. Soundtrack.
And so I have a stepdad, and he used to put on Top Gun with the surround sound. We had a surround sound system, and he would put that thing on so loud as the airplanes would fly by.
Yeah.
Oh, I think he was. Yeah. I think he was living out his Top Gun dreams.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So no, that's a good one. Okay, so what's your favorite food?
I don't know if it's a food, it's a drink, but coffee.
Yeah.
It's my favorite food. If we are picking like a food though, I'm gonna have to go in the moment with donuts.
Yeah, you are the donut guy. Yep, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and then activity. Again, that's hard because like, how do you pick like one thing? Because who just likes to do like one thing? But I thought I knew the answer. I'm gonna say. Reading.
Reading? Oh,
I guess free time. It's not an activity.
Our listeners just now are like, "Oh, these guys are boring." I think
it is tough. I love getting active with my family.
Oh yeah.
I do a lot of or used to run a lot, but just like hiking, like just getting outside in the mountains.
Sure.
Anything in the mountains. But I do enjoy fishing too. So
yeah, and reading is a good activity to do.
Yeah,
it is. I'm just teasing
exercises your brain. It
Yeah.
takes you to faraway places in your mind.
That's funny. Well, so today we have a really good question. This was brought to us from a student of a university, and it requires a little bit of context, but it's a very good question. And So context first, question afterwards. It's while in class at a local university, a group of students consistently spoke about how Christianity is inherently racist. Is Christianity inherently racist? And how do I respond to that as a Christian?
Man, such a college question.
It's a modern question, right?
Yeah. Man, and yeah, we've been talking about this for a little bit and kicking it around, and my first, as you know, when you ask me this, my first response is like, well, no, because it's it's from the Middle East,
Yeah.
it's when you look at like who Jesus was, like, my short answer is like, no, it's not racist. But there's a couple of things for me in that question. When I hear that question and I take it, seriously, and I start to break it down, is Christianity inherently racist? I think there's kind of three things in that question. You have to look at, Christianity. First off, what are we talking about?
Right. Yeah.
When we're talking about Christianity, the second thing is the word inherent. As the listeners don't know this, but you do. I'm big on words, and like,
yeah.
I really like to get into like, what is the word and what does it mean? Because like so often, and I do the same thing in my vocabulary, I'll use words where it's like I understand the word and the context, but when you say like, what does that word mean? It's like, I'd be like, well, I'm not exactly sure. Like I know it's kind of, like your kids are great at that. Like, well, what is that? And you're like, when you, but inherent, right? So it's like, what does the word inherent mean? And when you talk about inherent means it's when something is like essential, an essential quality.
Mm-hmm.
So then you come to the last word there, is Christianity inherently racism or racist?
Yeah.
Racist then is to show or feel discrimination or prejudice. So when I look at that question, is racism essentially, or is race an essential part or component of Christianity? And short answer, you have to say no.
Right, and it's almost, especially for somebody that's really strong in the faith. This is kind of it. It is almost like an offensive question in a way, wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, and that's the thing is like, I definitely, I know you and I kind of had like a response.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Like,
what?
Why would you even ask that?
Right.
But I can see how, these are the things that come up, especially like when you think, I said, such a college question. And the reason, because like in that age, where you're exploring things, you're questioning things, and it's a good time. And this isn't part of the answer. I don't think we should get off on this track, but when you look at the current like culture of college and like what's being done and professors and like that whole world is just so extremely secular.
It is.
So when you think of the context, it's like it's not necessarily a surprising question. And I really think it's based on like a misunderstanding of like what Christianity is.
Right. Oh yeah.
And when you look at what Christianity is, which the word literally means Christ follower. In the Greek, I did look this up. In the Greek, Christianity is Christianos, follower of Christ, and Christ is Christos, which is the anointed one. So when we're talking about following the anointed one, well, then we have to talk about, well, who's Christ?
Right.
Who is the anointed one?
Yeah, I think that's imperative to answer the question is, okay, who is this Christ then? Right.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think, looking at Jesus, and this is just, I love the great turn of events here, going from this question to being able to talk about like who Jesus is, I think is really cool. But when you look at Jesus, look at the context of the Old Testament, Jesus was the promised Messiah. The children of Israel throughout the Old Testament, they were the chosen race by God through Abraham. Going back in Genesis 12 is where the story kind of starts. But those first books of the Bible talk about the establishing of Israel, and the sons of Abraham, and how they became a people in Egypt, and the exodus out of Egypt, and the persecution. But throughout history, especially in the time of captivity, where Israel, Jerusalem, had been built up by the kings, King David, King Solomon, had established this line. All the kings had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord, which in the law was promised that they would pay for that. God is holy. And so they were looking forward after the captivity. Babylon and Assyria were two kingdoms that came in and just completely destroyed Israel, completely destroyed Jerusalem. And so they were looking forward, and they were promised a Messiah. They were promised an anointed one, a conquering king, a ruler who would come and save them. And they thought this was a physical salvation. And
yeah, right. They thought that it was gonna be some burly king that came in, and
right.
Yeah.
And that's, again, a question for another time,
Right.
what that salvation looks like. But that's what Israel, that's what they were looking forward to. They were looking for this anointed one, this Messiah. The word means anointed one, who would come, who would save the people,
Mm-hmm.
who would provide this rescue and this salvation. But when Jesus came, we just a month ago celebrated Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
We know the Christmas story.
Yeah.
It was a very, very humble beginning.
He came as a baby in a little farmhouse.
Yeah, very, very vulnerable.
Yeah.
His entry was announced to the people, like, the shepherds, who were kind of like the guys who spent time with the sheep. Like, oh yeah, so and so's a shepherd.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that explains it.
Oh.
And that was who he was announced to. But anyways, Jesus, when you look at his ministry, I would have to say Jesus was the most inclusive of people who were different than him.
Yeah, exactly. And
like the opposite of racist.
Especially during that time. That's through my research. That's kind of what I've been finding too, is that when you really dive into the person of Jesus and just his character, you find over and over and over again that he went to all places and talked to all different kinds of people. I mean, in his vicinity, that normally would not be talking to one another. Definitely in a nice way. So, yeah. And he did,
Totally. Yeah. And it's really cool. Like, at this time, Israel had kind of set themselves up as being God's chosen people. Like, they knew they were chosen. They, even though they didn't follow the law well, where God said, "I'll bless you," when you do these things. But they had, the Pharisees were a group at that time, the teachers of the law, and it was kind of this outward. You think about like the modern version of like a hypocrite, someone who says one thing, does something. I mean, these were the Pharisees, but it's like Israel as a people were very, I would say, very proud, even though they had been in bondage and everything. Like, they had maintained this, they'd really held on tightly to this thread that, like, well, we're God's chosen people. It's like,
right.
We're displaced out of our country. We're under Roman rule at the time that Jesus came, but it's like, but we have the law, so we have God. It was kind of
they're exclusive. They were
very exclusive. And so, like you said, like the conversations that Jesus had, in his ministry, Jesus, up until the time he was 30, he was a carpenter with his dad. His dad, Joseph, was a carpenter, and he was just, learning and growing. The Bible says several times that he grew in stature and in favor.
Oh yeah.
With God and man. And so just establishing this kind of low key, kind of hardworking reputation. But then when he stepped out into public ministry, which began with his baptism, when John the Baptist baptized Jesus, and the Spirit of God descended upon him like a dove, and the voice came from heaven and said, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." From that moment on, Jesus begins this 3-year intensive ministry of ministering to people that were really on the outskirts of society.
Yeah, he ministered to not just that exclusive group of the Jewish people, of the Jewish nation of Israel, and really ministered to a lot of people. So just, if I could jump into a couple things that I found just right off the bat. One thing that I found right away, you and I were doing a Bible study here last semester. We need to pick back up on that in Mark. And one of the things that you see in Mark 5 is Jesus heals a man in, how do you say this? Gerasenes?
Sure, that sounds good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so what's interesting about Gerasenes, though, is that is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, which is on the other side of the Jordan River.
Yeah.
And Jesus heals a man that was possessed. So that could tell us pretty much two things. For starters, he wasn't Jewish.
Yes.
So, and then based on the fact that it's on the east side of the Jordan, and he was possessed.
Yes.
So he was not a Jewish man. And Jesus went over and he actually healed this person. So right off the bat, chapter 5 of Mark, you get to see Jesus in an occasion really quickly healing somebody from outside of his group of people, because Jesus was Jewish.
Yeah.
And then again, we see it in John 4, where Jesus talks to a woman at the well, a Samaritan woman. And again, we see it in Matthew 8. Jesus heals a centurion servant. And what a centurion is a really fancy way of saying a Roman that's also, what is he, like
it's like a captain of 100.
Yeah, he's basically a man in charge. And why that's significant is during that time, the Romans basically were in rule over the area of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And when you had a centurion, they probably weren't going to, talk with, this Jewish man, Jesus.
Yeah.
So, but anyways, the centurion did. He did come to Jesus and asked for Jesus to heal his servant. And Jesus basically said, "No, this guy's got a lot of faith."
Yeah. Yeah, and so those are great examples, Greg. Just right off the bat, we've got the Samaritan woman, the man in Gerasenes, and the Roman centurion, all examples of Jesus ministering outside of his race, if you will. And like, I honestly really dislike the term racist because there's one race.
Yeah,
it's the human race.
Like, yeah, right? It's all one race.
That's such a, I don't know. You can say that's such a like, I don't know, white thing to say, I guess. But like, we're one race. We're created in the image of God. We're bearers of His image. We are all the same race. We are all mankind. I understand the differences in ethnicity, and I don't want to minimize at all the atrocities that have occurred throughout history against those of different ethnicities. But Jesus ministered to these people that were outside of His normal group.
Right.
And beyond just like the different nationalities, you look at who, again in Mark, in the beginning of Mark, his ministry primarily was to those marginalized by society. It was to the lepers who in the law, the lepers were essentially required to live outside of the city walls. Right. They were discriminated because they were unclean. They were ceremonially and actually physically diseased. They lived their lives outside of the city walls. And that's who Jesus went to. That's who He healed. He healed the blind. He healed the lame. He healed these people who would have been seen by the Jewish culture as, well, this is their sin, or this is the sin of their ancestors that is visited upon them. So not only do they have this disability, but they would say they're cursed. They've been cursed by sin. And so they would have if their own people, and they would have no contact with them.
Wow.
They would literally, when they gave like alms, because there's several occasions even in the book of Acts where you had the beggars at the temple. They would sit at the temple because people were coming to give tithes and gifts, and the people would literally throw their coins at the beggars because they didn't want to touch them. They didn't want to get near enough.
No way.
On their way to the temple. Yeah, they would literally throw the money at them.
Right.
And so we have that reminds me of when Jesus healed the blind man at the pool. I think it was at the pool of Bethsaida.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not sure the chapter. But there's this moment where Jesus spits, right? Where He spits on the ground to make clay and puts it on the man's eyes. And I had someone give me a perspective like, this man who was blind would have been familiar with the sound of someone spitting, but he would have been expecting it to hit him. Because like that's how they treated their own people, these marginalized. And it's like, and here's Jesus who spits on the ground, who makes his pace. And we don't know why He chose to do this, but He made some mud, put it on the man's eyes, and said, go to the pool, wash your eyes, and you'll be able to see.
It just reminds me, I know that, when we think of racism here in the United States, we think of, the 1950s, the 1960s, and then before that in our slavery days here.
Right.
But you're talking about, racism amongst, or a prejudice, as we should say, amongst every single group, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's the color of somebody's skin, whether it's their religion. Basically, there's quarrels happening constantly.
Yeah, and even like you look at, there were even structures within the priestly groups, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and there were even these upper religious teaching groups who had these beefs with each other because like this guy interpreted laws like you should have tassels on all the clothes you wear, and this guy didn't, and this guy believed in the resurrection of the dead, and this one didn't. And so you even had like these infightings, and Jesus came in and was like, I'm not even gonna I'm not even gonna start with like what your problem is. I'm gonna go to these who are so mistreated. Right. And we see Jesus doing that time and time again in His ministry. Awesome. And so I think, what I got into is when I started looking at this is like Jesus and like who Jesus was, right? So we're Christians, modern day Christians, jumping forward in the modern day, like we're followers of Jesus. But you have to look at like, well, who was Jesus? And you look at, I love the question. It's recorded in Matthew 16, but also in Mark 8, and it's somewhere in Luke as well. But Jesus essentially turns to his disciples, and this is towards the middle of his ministry, and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And he looks at them and he's like, you've seen all this. You've seen my ministry. You've heard, because people were calling him that he was possessed. The Pharisees said, "You're possessed by the devil." There's there's a passage there.
You've been too nice to everybody.
Yeah. They were calling him a blasphemer because he was saying that he was God. He was healing on the Sabbath. He was a sinner, like all these things. And he looks at his disciples and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter, Peter has his moments, but this is one of his good moments. And Peter says, "You are the Christ. You are the anointed one. You are the one that we've been waiting for." And it's a beautiful moment in the book of John. I love how the book of John opens up, and when you look at John, as far as like who is Jesus, when you look at John chapter 1, you see this. I love this, so I'm just going to read this. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Now that's only in the first verse. What's really cool here is that word, it's capital W, right. The Word. Okay. Yeah. So it's like it's speaking of a person, pronoun. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, so we get a little bit of more glimpse under the surface.
Connotation is Jesus. Yeah.
Was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That's the introduction of Jesus. Wow. John, the Gospel of John, out of the 4 Gospels, is different than the others.
It is.
And John introduces Jesus onto the scene as the Word. And what we talked about the Bible in our previous podcast. What is the Bible? And we talked about the Bible as the Word of God. Here, John is saying that Jesus is that Word. He is the Word of God. He is the breath of God. He has been with God from the beginning. We know that the context in Genesis of that God breathed out all life, like that was Jesus. Jesus was the Word in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and by him all things are made.
Sure.
So that recognition of Peter that like you are the Christ, you are the anointed one, goes beyond just like, oh, like you're something that was promised, but it's almost this underlying recognition of like you are the one who's been with God from the beginning.
Sure, that makes sense. And then also for those of you that haven't read maybe even any of the Bible, going back to just John here, John's take of the gospel and just John's book in the Bible is just beautiful, and I think that that's a good place to start. Yeah,
I think honestly, I think any of the 4 Gospels
for sure
are a great intro. But John, is very, very, especially in the beginning. When you're talking about the Word, it's different. It's a different book. The other 4 Gospels have a lot of things that line up. They're called the Synoptic Gospels, and then you have John, and it's a little bit different take, a different perspective. When you learn more about John as a disciple of Jesus, he held a different place. He calls himself in the book of John, but we know that the words are inspired by God. He calls himself, the one whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus. Now we know that Jesus loved them all.
Yeah.
But for some reason, God, that's included in there. That John. So John does give a different take on Jesus as the man.
Right, and you're right. All those books of the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are all beautiful and they're all factual. But yeah, for some reason, John for me has really resonated.
Yeah, John is good. So that's kind of like, who do people say that Jesus was? Right? Or who does his disciples say they recognize as Christ? Paul, the Apostle Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, talks a lot too about Jesus. Colossians, I love this too. Colossians 1, 15 through 23 Paul's talking about Jesus, who he was, and he says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, meaning resurrection from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel you have heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister.
Yeah, he doesn't say like whites only in there or anything like that, you know.
No, and exactly the opposite. He says that through Jesus and in Jesus, like in him are all things, and through him are all things hold together.
All races, all creeds.
So he's a unifier. You know, it's like, and there's so much more in there. You know, we could unpack the whole gospel story in that. But when you look at like who Jesus was, and Paul is his apostle and his closest followers, they saw like Jesus is God. Mm-hmm. Jesus is God in the flesh, made flesh, the image of the invisible God, which is awesome. And then when you look, I think next you have to look at like who Jesus said he was. And my favorite verse of who Jesus said he was, and this is in John 8, and he's talking to the Pharisees. The Pharisees, you know, this religious system, the leaders of the system, and they had, you know, set themselves on a pedestal. Abraham, right? Abraham was the first, the forefather, and Jesus essentially says, before Abraham was, I am.
Boom.
Yeah, and you have to know like the context, but like when God came to Moses, you know, who is the deliverer of the people in Exodus, you know, through him God delivered the people. God introduces himself in the burning bush to Moses, he says, who should I say sent me? And he says, I am who I am. So here Jesus says, I am. And my favorite thing about this verse is the response by the Pharisees is they picked up stones to stone him, like immediately, because Jesus says, I am. So like this is like, before this time, he'd kind of maybe tiptoed around the issue a little bit, but this is the first time where he's like, I am. So he's claiming equality with God. He's claiming he is God, and they're like, oh no.
Oh yeah, we're gonna throw down over that.
Spoiler, they didn't stone him at that time.
No, he got away, right?
It says he dispersed through the crowd.
It wasn't time yet.
Yeah. But I mean, and he says, you know, he goes on in John, there are 8 I am statements, which we don't have the time to look at, but are really awesome about who Jesus says that he, you know, I am the door, I am the shepherd. He says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And he's talking about reconciliation with God. He says in John 14:9, whoever has seen the Father, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Mm-hmm. Meaning like I and the Father are one. He says that also in John 10:30. But he's claiming equality with God.
He's the image bearer of God.
And when you think about if you you know are believing in God as like the creator of the world, and then God, you know, God is love. You know, it's like you hear that, but like that is true. You know, God loves his creation, and he especially loves mankind because we're made in his image. We're made to carry his image forward on the earth. And so I don't even see when you look at that concept of Jesus and who he is, that he is God, like it's impossible for him to discriminate.
Exactly.
It's impossible. And that's why that question, I think when you get to the core of it, when you boil it down to this point, it's like, that's why it's offensive on the surface.
That's why we have that reaction.
Followers of Jesus, because like, that's impossible.
It is. And so it's just one of those things where once you really get down to it, and once you build your faith up, you see that and you're like, no, this could never be.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Oh, so I mean, at that point, how do we respond to somebody?
Yeah. So I think really like what the question here, I don't think is Christianity racist? I mean, I know that technically it is the question.
Right.
But there's a question behind the question. And what I saw pretty quickly right away is the question is like, why is the church today, when we're talking the American church, you know, you could even say, you know, throughout like a political term, white evangelicals, why is the church today seen as racist?
Yeah, that's a good question.
A better question, because Christianity, you know, was started in the Middle East by a Jewish carpenter, who was the Son of God, and we follow him, and it was the most inclusive. It was the most revolutionary at the time, as far as like,
and still today, really.
yeah. And there's so many. We hit on a couple stories, but then you get into the stories of like the apostles, and you have Philip with the Ethiopian eunuch, who runs to this man, which is a whole nother story. He runs and catches up to a chariot and has a conversation while he's running alongside a chariot. But anyways, as a runner, I kind of like that story. But the Ethiopian eunuch, you have Paul. Paul's ministry was to get the gospel to Rome, which was the center of the universe at that time. And so it's like, here you have this Christianity, this concept that is just, it spread throughout the earth. You look at the first 1,000 years of the church, and like the Bible and the gospel was the one thing that endured without change through the first 1,000, and even into today, another 1,000 years.
Right.
Like, it's like,
and
something that's discriminatory is not going to spread like that.
Exactly. I know when I first became a Christian, back when I would say I really became a Christian in 7th grade, the reason why I became a Christian is because of the spread of Christianity. Is one of many things. I had a dream, and I'll talk about that later on sometime. But that was the first thing that I really studied, is the spread of Christianity, and as to why. And when you have a tyrannical government like the Roman Empire, and you have Christians that are really willing to die for this faith, it was because of being inclusive. It was because everybody was accepted into being a follower of Christ.
Yeah, there's no one turned away. It's God's desire that all should come to reconciliation and relationship.
So what happened with today's church?
Well, so I think you have to. It's a great question, and I think what you have to look at, throughout history, if nothing else, I think the church from the beginning was complicit. Was kind of like, I saw an article recently, and actually I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Really good, but it was saying how the church has been largely complicit in racism and race issues. It's saying, the article said, somewhere between general endorsement and quiet acceptance. So what I see, the problem that people are seeing, and the reason why the church would be viewed as racist now, is that we're not following Jesus well. Yeah. When you look at his example, we're not following well. I think that Christians, we should be on the forefront of race issues or gender issues, or we should be speaking truth into those issues. And Martin Luther King, the good doctor, said it best. He talked about how the church has been a tail light rather than a headlight. We've been responsive after the fact, as opposed to lighting the way with truth.
Right.
And I think that's really it. As Christians, it comes down to, we're not following Jesus well. Because when we look at the example of Jesus, he reached out to the marginalized. His ministry was to the lost, and his desire was that all would come to know him and to know God's love.
Yeah, no, that's powerful for sure.
And I think we're kind of coming to an end here, but I think you have to look at, in the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all share the same story about how the Pharisees came to Jesus and they were trying to catch him in a trap. And so they asked him, what is the greatest commandment? And we know there were the 10 commandments. And then there were another, I forget what it is, I think 600 other laws. I'm not sure in the exact number, between 400 and 600 other laws that they had interpreted from the books of the law. But they've got the 10 commandments were like the baseline. And so they're like, so what's the greatest commandment? Trying to trap him, because if he says any one thing, they can be like, oh, what about the other 9, blasphemer, whatever.
We're going to get him this time.
But he sums it up like this. He says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And without a pause, he says, and the second is this. Meaning this is equal to loving God, is to love your neighbor as yourself. So when the church is seen as racist, we're not following well. We're not loving our neighbor as ourselves. And so what's the answer for this? It might be corny, but be the change you want to see in the world. Follow Jesus well, love your neighbor well, love others well. So without question, when people look at us, they can say, oh, that's an example of Jesus Christ.
Sure. What I wrote down here is so how you should respond to somebody that has the assertion that Christianity is racist is I would say the first thing to do is ask a question as to why they feel that way.
That's good. That's good.
And so normally what you'll probably have after, maybe being through this question a little bit, not exactly this question, but anytime anybody has, a negative feeling towards Christianity, it's always good to ask, a quick question. And normally you'll get a response in what I would say is one of three ways. So you ask the question, why do you feel this way? And understand there might be an underlying hurt or emotional response.
Yeah, totally.
So just like you said, maybe somebody was hurt by that church.
Yes.
Maybe somebody was hurt by a church that really wasn't following, the church body wasn't following Jesus in the way that they should have been. They were being that tail light rather than that headlight.
Right.
But normally what you'll find is you'll get either an ignorant response, a pseudo-intellectual response, or that hurt response. Mm-hmm. So the ignorant response might be, I don't know, it's, that's just kind of what I've heard about Christianity. It's just, it's all white churches.
Look at the media.
Yeah, right.
Just something they've heard.
Yeah, I saw it on the news. Yeah. So, or you might see something to the effect of, Leviticus in one part implies that and it's always something that somebody has heard somewhere else. And the Bible does talk about slavery in places, but it's important to have that context.
Yeah, and just to comment to that real quick, in those places, it's really interesting when you look at the law and you look at those laws surrounding like the treatment of slaves. I think that demonstrates God's heart in that he knew that his people would fall into the same trap as the rest of mankind. He knew that there would be slaves. And so he's like, hey, this is how we protect. Mm-hmm. This is how, this is, and it's actually, when you look at those laws, it's an argument for equal treatment. The foreigners who were with them, the servants in the household, were seen to be on the same level in regards to the law. And I think it's really important, but that's just a little aside.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's good. And so anyways, when you ask that question and you get one of those three responses, the first thing is to never have too much pride to say like, hey, let me look into this. If you don't know, let me look into this and then we'll have this discussion later on because I want to find out for myself. But really, you could answer most of those questions, the hurt response, the pseudo-intellectual response, and also that just total ignorant response. Mm-hmm. You could really answer those and all those, and basically how we answered that here. You could look and say, hey, let's talk about Jesus's character, the Jesus that I know, and the reason why I follow Christ. Look at what he did with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, and all those stories that we talked about. And I think that there is no other conclusion than to say that Jesus was the least racist, the least prejudiced person of all time to this day.
Totally. Yeah, so good. Yeah, and such great insight, getting to the question behind the question. Mm-hmm. Like you said, those three things that are behind that.
And please, people, respond compassionately. Don't be like, this is so dumb.
That was kind of, but like my first response was pretty like, what? Really?
Yeah.
But I love it. I love it. And thanks for sending in that question. And along those lines, this show is going to be the best when we are diving into the questions that you have.
That was Blake McBain. I should have said that at the beginning. Yeah. He said I could say his name, and so I'm going to. So Blake, really appreciate the question.
Yes. Yeah, and answer back with compassion and get behind the question. But yeah, your questions are important to us. We'd love if you send them in. You can DM us on Instagram at questionsontheway. You can email your questions to questionsontheway@gmail.com. We're now up on all major podcast platforms. If you're listening on Apple, please review. Review us and rate us. And if you do that, it'll get this podcast in front of more people.
Give us all those stars.
Yeah, 5-star reviews. If you feel confident clicking that, but also the ratings. By writing something out, really will start to boost us to put us in front of other people. And again, if you've been with us for these last few episodes, I know this is number 3.
Yeah.
But that our heart is not to promote ourselves. Our heart is to make much of Christ.
Right.
And so the more that we can get out in front of people that are maybe struggling with these same kind of questions. I think the more that God will be glorified. And so that's really our heart and our desire. And yeah, we love you guys. We are on YouTube. The audio quality is not the best,
and
but
we don't look really all that good.
But it's maybe that's a little behind the scenes picture of how it goes down. But yeah, so share us, subscribe, like across different platforms. Let's generate some traction
and some pray.
Oh yes,
throw down some pray.
Please pray. Be praying for us that the questions that come in, will be sincere. That we will have the knowledge to answer them, to not operating in pride.
Right.
I kind of feel like I'm praying right now, but Lord, just send it forward. Jesus, to let your will be done. And yeah, thanks for listening today.
Amen. Peace.
Peace out.